Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a sixth grader, Jace Mills, and his journey at Seaside Middle School.
Sounds good.
And we actually have quite a few documents to help us kind of get a sense of, what's going on in his educational world.
Yeah.
We have IEPs, meeting notes, a functional behavior assessment. We even have a behavior support plan.
Oh, wow. We've got the whole package.
We really do, yeah. So our goal is really to understand Jace's progress, what challenges he's facing, and what support systems are in place.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really interested in seeing how all these documents connect and how we can make this deep dive useful to you all. So we're going to focus on clear takeaways and actionable recommendations.
Aye.
Ready to dive in?
Absolutely. I love to see how all this data can actually help students in the real world.
Okay, let's start by getting to know Jace. His IEP really paints this picture of him. His teachers describe him as having this incredible memory. He has a constant need for movement and kind of a unique way of connecting with others.
Interesting.
They even mention his love for striking superhero poses, like all the time.
Oh, wow.
Sounds like he's got a lot of personality.
That's awesome. And what's fascinating here is how these observations can actually tell us a lot about his learning style and his needs. That remarkable memory, for example, we often see that in kids on the autism spectrum and the whole movement thing. That suggests he's a sensory seeker. Basically, he just thrives on movement and, tactile input.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of this one thing his teachers mentioned in the IEP.
Oh.
So every time they think they've hidden the iPad in a new, safe spot, Jace has already figured out where it's been kept before. Every single time.
He was like one step ahead.
Talk about observational skills.
Right, exactly. And that's not just a funny story. It actually shows us how we can use Jace's strengths in his education. Maybe incorporating more movement breaks, hands-on activities, or even visual learning tools. I think that could really help him.
I love that idea. Tapping into his visual memory. His teachers also mentioned his obsession with Marvel characters.
Oh, I see that all the time. Superheroes are big.
Yeah. I mean, they really capture his imagination.
That's a great insight, actually. Remember, if you understand what a kid is interested in, that can be super powerful for keeping them engaged.
You're right.
Imagine if we could bring those Marvel characters into his schoolwork. It could totally change his motivation and focus.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's all about finding those creative ways to connect with them.
Right? Yeah, definitely.
But the IEP also mentions some challenges, though.
Right.
His teachers note some difficulties with transitions and sensory overload, and there are a few incidents of what they're calling elopement.
Yeah. It's important to acknowledge these challenges, of course.
Definitely.
But we also got to remember his strengths, too. These behaviors. As concerning as they are, they're often how kids on the spectrum communicate, especially if they struggle with talking about their needs.
So it's not about being defiant. It's more about communicating the best way he knows how.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the why behind these behaviors is so important. If we can figure out what triggers these things and what purpose they serve for him, then we can actually start coming up with some better ways to support him.
That makes sense. I'm looking at this functional behavior assessment right now, or FBA as they call it. It seems like this is kind of a key document to understanding why Jace does what he does.
Yeah, the FBA is like a deep dive into the behaviors. It looks at what causes those behaviors, what they do for the child, and how we can help. It's basically like a roadmap for understanding and supporting a student.
I see. I'm really interested in those incidents of elopement. It sounds like on a couple of occasions he actually left the school building.
That is definitely a serious concern. But the FBA can really shed some light on what might be going on for him in those moments. It seems that elopement often happens when he's given a really difficult task, especially during one-on-one instruction.
So is it possible that Jace's elopement is like his way of saying, I need a break? Especially since he has trouble communicating verbally.
That's a really good point, and it actually fits with what the FBA suggests. It basically says that, for Jace, elopement is a way to escape a tough situation, a way to communicate that he needs a break.
So if we understand that, we can start putting supports in place, maybe like scheduled breaks, visual timers, or even teaching him how to ask for a break using a picture card or something.
Exactly. It's all about changing the way we think about these behaviors.
Yep.
We need to see them not as problems, but as opportunities to learn and grow.
I love that. It looks like this behavior support plan, the BSP, takes all this information from the FBA and puts it into action, right?
Absolutely. The BSP lays out specific ways to support Jace and teach him better ways to communicate his needs. It focuses on creating a structured environment, using visuals, and providing those sensory breaks we were just talking about.
So are we ready to dive into those session notes, see what we can find out?
I think so. Let's get into the details.
All right.
Okay, let's take a look at these notes from Jace's occupational therapy sessions. They give us a lot of good info about his sensory processing patterns and how that affects his behavior.
You mentioned earlier that he's a sensory seeker.
Right.
So he really likes certain types of sensory input.
Yeah.
But are there any that are overwhelming for him?
Oh, exactly. So the therapist notes that while Jace loves movement and deep pressure, he can be super sensitive to loud noises and visual clutter. She describes him as easily dysregulated in busy places.
I can only imagine how tough that is,
Yeah.
especially in a middle school.
Right. And we see that reflected in the session notes over and over again. There are multiple times when his behavior escalated during transitions. Like when he was going from a quiet, structured activity to a chaotic environment, like the cafeteria or the playground.
So even those simple transitions are big triggers for him.
Yeah, and the therapist points out how important it is to prepare him for those transitions. She suggests visual schedules, like giving him clear warnings about what's coming next, and even offering him a safe space to go to if he starts feeling overwhelmed.
It seems like that proactive approach is really key here.
I agree. Anticipate those triggers. Have a plan in place. That can make all the difference.
I see.
The notes also say that certain sensory inputs can be very regulating for him. The therapist talks about how giving him a weighted lap pad or letting him do those deep pressure activities like jumping on a trampoline, those things can actually help him calm down and focus.
I love that. It's amazing how those simple things can have such a big impact.
Right. It shows just how powerful it is to understand and address those sensory needs. She even tried adding sensory breaks into his sessions.
Oh, interesting.
And the notes show that this actually made a big difference. His challenging behaviors went way down.
That's awesome. So are there any takeaways here that could be used in other settings too?
Absolutely. The session notes give us some really practical ideas. For example, the therapist suggests creating a sensory toolkit for him.
What is that?
Basically, it's a collection of things like fidget toys, noise-canceling headphones, weighted objects, stuff he can use whenever he feels overwhelmed.
I love that. It gives him some control over his own sensory experiences.
Exactly. The notes also say how important communication is between the therapist, teachers, and parents.
Of course.
They all need to be on the same page when it comes to understanding his triggers and implementing those support strategies.
Speaking of parents, I'm curious to hear their perspective on all of this. I know they provided some really detailed notes too.
Those parent notes are gold. They give us a much broader view of Jace's experience both at home and at school.
I'm really interested in seeing how his progress on his IEP goals lines up with their observations.
Good point. The IEP sets specific academic and behavioral goals for Jace, so it's super important to see if those are actually translating into real-world progress.
One of his goals was to improve his ability to stay focused during small group instruction. Have his parents noticed any changes there?
Actually, yeah. They specifically mentioned that he's been more focused and engaged during family game nights.
Oh, that's great.
Which often involves turn-taking and following rules, just like in a small group setting. They even said that just recently, Jace was able to play a whole game for 30 minutes without getting distracted or needing a break.
Oh, that's incredible progress. It sounds like those strategies they're using at school are really working at home too.
It seems that way, yeah. His parents also say that he's using his sensory toolkit a lot at home, especially during homework time.
That's awesome.
He'll grab a fidget toy or put on his headphones when he starts to feel overwhelmed, and it helps him get back on track and finish his work.
It's so encouraging to see him learning to regulate himself and ask for what he needs.
Right. It's so important to give students that ownership of their learning journey.
I bet there's still some areas where he struggles, though.
Of course. And it's important to acknowledge those too. His parents are still frustrated with his emotional regulation, especially when he can't have something he wants or when his routines are disrupted.
Those meltdowns can be really tough for everyone.
I know. They also mentioned some concerns about his social skills. They say he has trouble starting conversations with other kids, and he often prefers to play by himself.
Sounds like that's an area where he needs more support.
Definitely. The notes say that his parents are actively looking for social skills groups.
Great.
And trying to give him opportunities to interact with other kids in a structured way.
That's awesome that they're so proactive about his social development.
They are, yeah. And their perspective is so valuable for figuring out how to support him overall.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen Jace's strengths, his challenges, and all the interventions and supports that are in place. But what does this all mean for our listeners?
Right.
How can we take all of this and make it useful? Like, what can we do to actually help Jace?
That's the big question, isn't it? Let's move on to the last part of our deep dive. We'll put everything together and come up with some concrete suggestions for supporting Jace as he continues to grow.
All right, so we've really gotten to know Jace through all these documents. We've seen his strengths, we've seen his challenges, and the incredible efforts of his family and educators to support him.
It's really impressive, actually.
It is.
So now, for the most important part, what can we take away from all this?
Right.
What concrete steps can we actually take to help enhance his educational journey even more?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's not enough to just have the information.
Right.
We've got to put it into action. And luckily, we have a ton of insights to work with here.
So, based on everything we've talked about,
Mm-hmm.
what are some key recommendations that stand out to you?
Well, first things first, consistency is key. We've seen how well those strategies are working in his occupational therapy sessions and at home, right?
To really help him progress, we need to make sure those same strategies are being used everywhere. At school, at home, basically anywhere he goes.
That makes a lot of sense. A unified approach is so important.
Mm-hmm.
What specific strategies would you recommend focusing on?
Given his sensory issues and how he gets dysregulated during transitions, I'd say a structured transition plan throughout the school day is crucial.
Okay.
This could be something like using visual timers to get him ready for changes, giving him clear warnings about what's coming next,
Mm-hmm.
and even building in those sensory breaks before and after potentially difficult transitions.
I like that. Those are really practical suggestions, easy to implement too.
Exactly. And don't forget about that sensory toolkit we discussed. Making sure he has access to that throughout the day is really important.
Yeah, that was a great idea.
Whether it's those fidget toys, noise-canceling headphones, or that weighted lap pad, those can really help him manage his sensory input and regulate himself.
And what about those social interaction challenges his parents mentioned?
Mm-hmm.
Any advice for supporting him in that area?
Social skills training is definitely something to look into. This could involve individual therapy sessions to work on things like conversation skills, understanding social cues, and practicing how to interact appropriately.
I see.
And giving him chances to participate in structured social activities with other kids who have similar interests could be really helpful.
It seems like his parents are already pretty good at finding those kinds of opportunities for him, though.
Yeah, they are, and that's fantastic. Open communication between the parents, teachers, and therapists is so important. Everyone needs to be on the same page, working towards the same goals for Jace.
Definitely a team effort.
Absolutely. And remember, we're not just trying to fix problems here. We want to help Jace use his strengths, too.
Right.
That incredible memory, his love of movement, his fascination with superheroes, all of that.
All part of who he is.
Exactly. We can bring those things into his learning experiences and make it all more engaging for him. One last thought, though.
Yeah,
Don't forget to celebrate his progress, no matter how big or small.
that's a good point.
Every step forward, every time he self-regulates, every time he's engaged, that's a win.
I love that. It's easy to focus on the challenges, but celebrating those little victories is so important, too. Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Jace Mills's educational journey. I really hope this has given you some valuable insights and some strategies that you can actually use to help support Jace as he continues to grow.
Me too.
Every child is unique, and when we take the time to understand their individual needs and their strengths, we can create learning environments that are truly supportive and allow them to flourish. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.